welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Lawrence A. Strick, I'm Peter B. Collins. In our second segment today, we'll talk with Ford Greene and Matt Brown about the recent election and controversial flood control proposals in San Anselmo. First, we welcome journalist Peter Byrne, an independent reporter who focuses on health and science. Through January, the Reyes Light is publishing his 10-part special investigation that Peter funded through Kickstarter, and I will disclose here that I was one of his investors, and I'm glad I did. The series is called Busted: Breast Cancer, Money, and the Media. Peter Byrne, welcome.
Thanks.
So your 10-part series is very well researched and documented. You challenge the widely held belief that Marin County is the site of a cluster of breast cancer cases, one of the highest rates in the country. You've reviewed the data and state flatly that there never was an epidemic of breast cancer targeting affluent white women in Marin. So please give us a little background. Where did this notion originate, and why were the data misinterpreted to lead to Marin County being called the breast cancer capital of the world?
Well, first of all, it's not just my opinion, Peter, that Marin County does not have a breast cancer epidemic. My reporting relies on quoting studies and interviews with reputable epidemiologists, not only in the Bay Area, but around the country, and it's their opinion that I'm channeling. It arose in the mid-1990s. Mammography became widely available in the late 1980s. And when people start getting mammograms in any given population, obviously the rate of breast cancer diagnosis goes up. And in populations that have access to good quality health care, which tend to be populations with the demographics of, say, Marin or Long Island or Shaker Heights, Ohio, or Cape Cod, which all have similar problems, the incident rate tends to peak quite rapidly because people are getting a lot of mammograms, as opposed to, say, populations that are more socioeconomically disadvantaged, where people aren't getting very many mammograms. So suddenly, the Cancer Registry of California announced that Marin County in particular, but also the Bay Area and communities with wealthy white women throughout California, had the highest rates of breast cancer in the world. They did this in the mid-90s. And this caused a furor politically in the Bay Area. Politicians and activists who formed around the issue began to question the Center for Disease Control about why the incident rates were so high. The Center for Disease Control did a study over about a 2-year period and determined that the rates were high because women in Marin County and other areas, similar areas, were getting more mammograms than women elsewhere. It's really quite simple. It's the simplest explanation. However, the people in the Bay Area, at least the activists and the politicians and a number of public health officials, didn't want to hear that. They began to scream that the CDC was lying and covering up a breast cancer epidemic. And people thought there must be radioactive sites or some kind of chemicals in the water in Marin. And that was explored. Nobody ever had any evidence of that. However, there's plenty of evidence that women in Marin were receiving and continue to receive substantially more mammograms than women of in other counties. The press latched onto this like they latch onto Donald Trump. I mean, it was like, headlines: Killer stalks Marin in the San Francisco Chronicle. Headline: breast cancer caused more in wealthy white women, literally. And story after story, these reporters from the Chronicle and KQED and the rest of the Bay Area media, and it reverberated around the country and even the world, were making these huge statements that for reasons that cannot be explained, wealthy white women in Marin County are getting more breast cancer than anybody anywhere. Now, it's really interesting to think about reasons that can't be explained. These reporters were channeling a series of studies released by a group called the Northern California Cancer Center, now called the Cancer Prevention Institute of California. It is part of the California Cancer Registry, which has gotten billions of dollars over the years to assess cancer incident rates in California. So the Cancer Prevention Institute of California was collecting data and then massaging it and doing its own studies and coming up repeatedly with these very scary statistics, culminating in 2002 when they said that the rate of breast cancer for wealthy white women in Marin was 38% higher than the California average. Well, immediately the press just picked up on that. It was just an earthquake of fear was unleashed. People in Marin and wealthy white women everywhere, I guess, were wondering, well, why am I more at risk of breast cancer? However, what the press didn't pick up on what happened 2 years later, which was the Cancer Prevention Institute put out a new paper that basically retracted that statement because it turns out that the demographic, the population data they relied upon was incorrect. And actually it was only about 5% higher.
So let me see if I get this right. All these people are going through some data that was collected by someone who's got a lot of money or a big pharma or someone's giving them a lot of money.
No. It's collected. There's a law in California that says that every cancer diagnosis has to be reported within 6 months to the California Cancer Registry.
So they're looking at that data and coming up with all kinds of theories about it. And your theory, boiling down your theory.
Not my theory. It's the theory
No.
of scientists.
What you're finding and what you believe is one explanation, or the explanation, is that the mere fact that Marin white affluent women are getting examined for cancer more frequently than other types of people means it's going to be found more frequently.
Correct.
It just boils down to that.
Correct.
It's simple. The more you look for something, the more you're going to find it.
Exactly.
And so what's the significance of that? Where do we go from there?
Well, it means there's no cancer cluster. But year after year, the Cancer Prevention Institute and the Marin Department of Public Health and other epidemiologists that worked on, had grants to work on papers in collaboration with the Cancer Prevention Institute. If you read the whole paper, it would say at the end, actually, all of this could be explained by mammography rates being greater in Marin County. We just don't think it is. Now, they framed it as excess rates that can't be explained. Then they gave credence to the existence of data, which exists, showing that the mammography rates were significantly higher and could easily account for the excess, and said it could. But I guess reporters never read beyond the abstract, which never said that. It didn't say that. It didn't qualify it in the abstract.
And Peter, one of the other factors here is that mortality rates were not matching or consistent with the levels of diagnosis. Is that another?
Right. In epidemiology, mortality is the only meaningful endpoint to look at the prevalence of a disease in a population. Because incident rates are not equivalent to risk. Incident rates are snapshot at a particular period of time, and there's a formula that goes with it, and it's very esoteric, but it is not what people think it is. It does not actually measure the amount of cancer in a population. However, mortality is pretty final, and if you're assessed to have died of breast cancer, that's a pretty good stat. Except there is problems with death certificates because when people get older, it's hard to determine what they actually died of sometimes. Mm-hmm. But the mortality rates are treated the same everywhere, and in Marin County, they've been flat or declining over this whole period. So if you were getting more actual breast cancer, you would expect to see more breast cancer deaths, mm-hmm. and you didn't. The gap between the mortality rate and the climbing incident rate is attributable to two things. One, just flat out overdiagnosis, which is a phenomenon that's becoming increasingly talked about in medical circles. It's thought that about a quarter of all breast cancer diagnoses are of cancers that are either indolent, that would never actually proceed to be life-threatening or harming in any way, because we all have a reservoir of abnormal cells in our body, or they're ductal carcinoma in situ, which is no longer thought to actually be a cancer. Mm-hmm. It's a collection of abnormal cells.
Well, take a moment to briefly explain DCIS and also tell us briefly about Dr. Renee Willard, who you profile in your series.
Well, DCIS, when mammography came into being, it takes an X-ray of your breasts, so it's finding cellular abnormalities that you could not detect through palpitation or and there are no symptoms of it. They're just microscopic inconsistencies. Some of those abnormalities do progress to be invasive cancers, but it's actually a fairly small percentage. However, the standard of care is that anytime there's a diagnosis of DCIS, the standard of care is surgical or combined with chemo and radiation. It's to basically extirpate the cells. I profiled Dr. Renee Willard, who ironically was a scientist who got her PhD studying how estrogen related to breast cancer development evolution. And she had moved to Marin, and about 2 years after she moved here, she turned 40 and she got her second mammogram, and they called her and said that she had cancer. And her thought was, oh my God, I just moved here and now I'm one of those women. Because she'd been reading for years these headlines in the San Francisco Chronicle, Kilmer stalks Marin,
And Peter, let me just jump in because we only have a minute left. But she had a lumpectomy, then she had a mastectomy, and then a biopsy that showed, in fact, that she didn't have cancer.
Correct.
So how prevalent is that scenario? How often does that happen?
Well, it's hard to say because the cancer registry doesn't actually collect data that shows if you have cancer or not after you're treated. But Gilbert Welch and other doctors and epidemiologists that have looked into this matter are pretty concerned that up to a quarter of all cancer diagnoses are of either DCIS that didn't need to be treated or of abnormalities that were not going to proceed to be.
So looking at this problem from your point of view, if you had to make a recommendation to women in Marin as to how to move forward when they get information that from their gynecologist about the possibility of breast cancer, what would you recommend?
Well, I personally wouldn't recommend to any specific woman anything, not being a medical professional. However, I would recommend to all women who live in Marin to read my series, which is available online at the point Reyes Light, Busted, Breast Cancer, Money, in the Media. In the 10 parts, I go into a great deal of detail about what your actual risk is. It's not 1 in 8 women are going to get breast cancer, not even close to that. I go into the perils of mammography and the newest studies that have come out showing that mammography actually causes more harm than it does good. And pretty much dissect the Marin Department of Health, who took millions of dollars from Avon to mount the Marin Women's Study, which turned out to be a scientific how shall I put it? It turned out to be invalid, shall I?
Peter Byrne, I wish we had more time. I want to invite people to read your important series at the Point Reyes Light website or in the actual newspaper. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
San Anselmo Town Council member Ford Greene returns to our show today. In November, he won election to a 3rd term, and he will serve as mayor for the next year. Also joining us is Matt Brown, who was elected to his 1st term on the council in November. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great. You two engineered a real upset in this past election. Ford, you overcame the controversies related to your fight with the town over the zoning of your building on Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. And with Matt, you rode a wave of opposition to the council majority's flood abatement plan that involved the option of turning Memorial Park into a temporary catch basin. You rallied that opposition to pass Measure D and defeat the competing Measure E. You converted all of your petition signers to voters and then some. And in political science terms, it was a masterstroke of grassroots politics. And I say that as a resident who didn't support Measure D. So congratulations.
Thank you.
What does it mean? What did you glean from this process and from working with residents to pass Measure D and really establish that point of view related to flood abatement in San Anselmo?
Well, I think Matt's the one that ought to answer that question because he was one of the originating signers and movers behind Measure D. My position was different. I was on the town council and in support of the voters having an opportunity to vote whether or not to transform Memorial Park rather than being steamrollered over by the other members of the town council. So ask Matt.
Sure. The most important outcome was that the people got their say. And for 3 years leading up to the election, many concerned citizens asked numerous questions, probably 100 questions that went unanswered, as if the detention basin at Memorial Park was a fait accompli. So being stonewalled, we went to the people, and the people had a choice. I'm vehemently opposed to the detention basin itself for a variety of reasons, but I was more interested in the people having their say, and that is the significant outcome.
And it sounds to me like even after the people elected to have their say and have a ballot measure, then the town council goes ahead and puts a conflicting ballot measure on the ballot. Is that what happened?
Well, I'm probably the one better qualified to answer that particular question.
And that's sort of reminiscent to me to what the water district did in the desalination issue when they put on competing measures, and that doesn't seem to work very well. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, first, sitting up there on the town council and watching citizen after citizen after citizen come and express concerns and reservations about a detention basin at Memorial Park, and really, it was worse than being blown off.
So they didn't want it.
The people didn't want it. The council did want it. The council's behavior lacked tolerance. So when people would come and express their opinions and their concerns, they'd be met with big sighs and eye rolling and a lot of palpable disregard. And so after a while, people got sick of that and got fed up. And Matt and others then put it on the ballot. So before a good year before that happened, in April of 2014, before us, the town council, came the agreement for $8.7 million grant with the Department of Water Resources to cover half of the cost of improving Memorial Park. And so the rest of the council members were all about the money, which is fine, but the disregard for the voters remained. And it was at that point that I started registering my solo dissenting vote and saying, no, don't do this before you get the permission of the people to do it, because it's too big a deal. It's too impactful. Too many people are invested in Memorial Park. It's too big a change. Let the people vote on it. So, but council didn't want to do that. They wanted to steamroller their plan. And so when ultimately, in less than a month time, the promoters of what became Measure D obtained 1,400 signatures to put the initiative on the ballot, town council was shocked. So at that point, the council started coming up with what they termed a competing measure, which was Measure E. And Measure E, in my estimation, was really deceptive, because it said that, well, what we'll do is we'll do an environmental review process first, and after that process, then we'll have a vote. So what's wrong with what we're proposing? We'll look at it more, and your vote will still be protected. What the Measure E promoters did not say is that the financial consequence of their plan was to put the town's general fund at a $1.5 million risk, because the terms of the grant said, ultimately, if you don't build a project, any money we've given you, you have to give back, and you don't get any more, and the cost of the EIR process was going to be $1.5 million. So the E promoters were not being honest with the voters and saying, listen, this is the cost of what our alternative is. And so that was a big issue that I raised a lot during the course of the campaign that I think resonated a lot with the voters.
And the smart voters of San Anselmo figured it out.
They did.
And without trying to put words in your mouth, I would characterize that attitude of the council majority as kind of patronizing, that they know what's best, and they had they exhibited a kind of insider's mentality that they would outmaneuver the community activists who clearly prevailed in this struggle.
Well, yes, and I mean, that arrogance is really what it is. Unfortunately, is a feature, I think that just gets bred into local elected politicians. It's really easy to become a victim of peer group pressure, to instead of listening to voters and asking hard questions and exhibiting one's own lack of knowledge or otherwise not being sure exactly where to go, officials say Father knows best. And what the real rub is the attitude is not only do we know what's best, but any opposition is not because there's substantial issues that have merit that have to be weighed and have to be debated and have to be discussed. It's because you're a liar. And that's what I think alienated people in this campaign a lot, because well, you got one of these. Mm-hmm. And so when you get something like this, and you have Jared Huffman's picture on the back, then this half truth plus half truth equal lie was the characterization of all of the supporters of Measure D, and myself included. And I think people saw through that and got turned off by it, much in the same way voters got turned off in the election between Levine and Michael Allen, mm-hmm. when there were all of those ugly, bald, sort of face mailers coming in that obviously weren't real. Mm-hmm. And so the same, it was a very nasty election, because what the town unfortunately did was, rather than address the issues on the merits, said that the Measure D supporters were liars. You got people with kids and that go to the park and that are normal and that are nice, and they're not liars. They care about what's going to happen to their park. And so that was a big turnoff, I think.
And yeah. Matt, was one of the irritants that along the way here, they spent some money on PR consultants to try to sell the residents of the town on a proposal that it's pretty clear many people rejected.
That's, for me, one of the most amusing things. Ultimately it was about a vote of the people, but this was not a fair fight, right? They had a couple $100,000 of flood fee money to spend on promoting the overall flood program. And so with a very simple door-to-door grassroots effort, we were able to overcome that. Mm-hmm. And their only explanation is we lied to the voters.
So now that the election's gone, it's mm-hmm. over, people are talking about rains are coming. There's been floods there numerous times over the past few years. What's the plan? What's plan B here, guys?
Let me handle this. You've been doing all the talking.
You're right. Sounds fair to me.
Last night, Flood Zone 9 had a meeting in San Anselmo's town chambers, and for the first time in a while, Lefty Gomez Field got the spotlight, and all of the same arguments, all the same questions are coming out about Lefty Gomez that we heard 3 years ago on Memorial Park.
And Lefty Gomez is in Fairfax.
It's out just outside of the town limits of Fairfax. It's mm-hmm. a piece of property that's owned by the Ross Valley School District. It's 15 acres in size. It is scheduled to cost, I think, $6.1 million, a price that hasn't changed in 4 years.
This is to purchase the piece of property?
No, this is the development of a detention basin on the site. This site has all the same components as Memorial Park and is half again as big as Memorial Park. Memorial Park was going to be close to $19 million when all is said and done. Why is this thing still being sold to the voters as a $6.1 million project? So I was very focused about the fiscal aspects of the overall flood plan. And last night, there's a new, I think it's our 4th chief engineer that has been assigned to this project on behalf of the county, and he said something very fascinating last night. And he says, from the national level and the state level, we're recharacterizing flood proofing to risk mitigation. So ultimately, that's what we're after, is risk mitigation. What we're trying to do is limit the amount of damage that will be inflicted upon the people who live and work in a flood zone. So there's many local measures that can be done on the ground for a fraction of the money that we've been talking about in the overall replumbing of a Ross Valley. And we're roughly halfway through a $40 million flood fee program. We spent about $10 million, and we're still no closer to anything reducing flooding that we have.
And
all we've been doing
What
is
did the $10
studying.
million go to?
It's been studying this problem. It's gone for engineers and surveying and propagandists for the communication program that they've had.
And they haven't, I mean, one of the projects that seems to have consensus is to put up a temporary expansion of the dam at Phoenix Lake.
That's not necessarily, because if you stand on the dam at Phoenix and you look up to either reach of the lake and you look at the top of the spillway and you imagine what the hydrostatic pressure is going to be if that probably 8 to 10 feet span has got water behind it, there needs to be an entirely new dam.
Well, they don't know that for
They're
sure,
talking
but that's
about
what they're studying.
retrofitting.
They don't know whether or not that dam can hold the extra water that is being proposed to
So,
sit
so
behind
it
that
sounds
dam.
like your guys' concern is that they're going to blow through the 40 million or damn close to it
With nothing to
with
show.
nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
you're talking about simpler measures that may be employed to
Yeah.
abate some of the risks that homeowners are going to have in February. What are they?
Well, I don't think that there is a solution that is practical politically or financially to replumb this entire valley. Now, Tom McInerney himself, one of our colleagues on the town council, his home was flooded in 2005. He took the effort to raise his home up out of the floodway. That is and many of his neighbors on Nokomis did the same. That is a very prudent, very sensible thing for a homeowner to do. And what I would prefer is to figure out how we can leverage the flood fee that everybody has paid into to make that possible for more of the homeowners and business owners, in the low-lying areas.
You mean like low interest loans type
Yes.
of thing?
Well,
Is that what
whatever's
you're saying?
possible. Whatever's possible. Whether it's reduced fees or.
Gentlemen, we have limited time here, and I want to note you mentioned Tom McInerney. When he was on our show here a few months ago, he was very critical of you, Ford Greene. And in mid-December, he cast the deciding vote to make you mayor of San Anselmo.
He did.
He could have gone the other way and
could have.
settled a score if he wanted to try.
It wouldn't have settled the score.
Well, just briefly, what does that mean, and how will you respond going forward?
How I did respond on the spot was to take him at face value, to treat him with good faith, and to be reciprocal, not just in words, but by offering him my position on the Transportation Authority of Marin, really as a gesture of thanks and good faith, which he took. And the choice that I had to do, or that I had at the time, was that it looked like I was going to be mayor, and I had the choice whether to hog the power that I've been able to accumulate or share it. And I made the determination that the good faith political move was to respond by sharing it, and I knew that Tom wanted it, and I offered it, and he took it.
Very nice. Thank you. Ford, Matt, thanks for being with us today. Great to talk to you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Peter. Thank you, Larry.